Hollywood paints ancient Rome as a shining city of white marble and glory. But the reality of this ancient empire was far darker and incredibly filthy. Behind the grand monuments hid a cramped metropolis overflowing with disease and danger. Let us uncover the hidden historical nightmares that the blockbuster movies ignore completely. We begin in the slums, where the vast majority of Roman citizens lived. Most Romans were crammed into towering apartment blocks known as the dangerous insulae. These wobbly wooden structures were poorly built and constantly on the verge of collapse. Landlords built them as high as possible, ignoring safety to maximize their profits. The higher up you lived, the cheaper the rent and the worse the conditions. Families on top floors trapped in tiny rooms lived in constant fear of fire. Because there was no running water upstairs, residents used indoor braziers for cooking. This created a massive fire hazard that frequently sent entire city blocks burning. When fires broke out, the people trapped on the top floors had no escape. Rome did have a fire brigade, but they were notoriously corrupt and often slow. Crassus famously bought burning buildings for pennies before allowing his men to extinguish them. Without indoor plumbing in the apartments, dealing with human waste became daily torture. People commonly threw their chamber pots out the window into the crowded streets. Walking to the market meant risking a sudden shower of sewage from above. Public toilets were communal spaces where dozens of citizens sat shoulder to shoulder. They wiped themselves using a shared sponge attached to a stick called xylospongium. This shared sponge spread horrific parasites and diseases rapidly among the local population. If disease did not kill you, the crime-infested night streets certainly would. Rome had no official police force to protect citizens from muggers after sunset. Wealthy elites hired private bodyguards to escort them safely through the dark alleys. The poor were left completely defenseless against violent gangs who ruled the night. Stepping into a dark alley often meant losing your coin purse or life. Daylight did not wash away the grime, as streets doubled as open sewers. Stepping stones were placed so pedestrians could avoid wading through the raw filth. Stray dogs and wild pigs roamed these foul streets, scavenging through rotting garbage. The overwhelming stench of rotting meat and sewage hung over the entire capital. To escape this misery, the public flocked to the arena for gladiator games. Movies show gladiators as chiseled bodybuilders, but real fighters looked vastly different indeed. They were mostly covered in a thick layer of fat for protection. This extra weight absorbed shallow sword slashes and prevented fatal damage during fights. Their diet was mostly barley and beans, earning them the nickname barley eaters. Furthermore, these fighters were expensive investments, so battles to death were surprisingly rare. Promoters had to pay massive fines to the owners if someone was killed. Most matches ended when one fighter surrendered by raising a single tired finger. Referees closely monitored the bouts to ensure rules were followed and investments protected. Yet, for criminals and prisoners of war, the arena was an execution ground. Behind all of Rome's grandeur was a brutal economy dependent on human slavery. Slaves accounted for roughly 1/3 of the entire population in ancient Italy. Captives from conquered lands were brought back in chains and sold in markets. They were stripped, inspected, and auctioned off like cattle to the highest bidder. Families were ruthlessly torn apart, crying in anguish as they were separated forever. Household slaves faced constant abuse and lived at the mercy of their masters. A master could legally torture or kill his slave without facing any consequences. If a slave killed their master, Roman law demanded executing all household slaves. Many were forced to endure grueling labor in silver mines until they broke. Agricultural slaves worked estates in chains, sleeping in crowded underground stone prison cells. For ordinary citizens lacking kitchens, street food was the only way to eat. Taverns called popine served hot food, but they were notoriously seedy and dangerous. Patrons crowded around stone counters to eat cheap sausages, bread, and salted fish. These taverns were hubs for gambling, prostitution, and violent brawls among lower classes. Wealthy Romans completely avoided these establishments, viewing them as filthy dens of sin. The wine served in these cheap taverns was often turning sour into vinegar. To make cheap wine taste better, merchants sometimes sweetened it using toxic lead. Lead was also used extensively in the plumbing pipes carrying water to elites. Over time, this daily lead exposure caused severe neurological damage and chronic pain. Historians still debate if lead poisoning contributed to the fall of the empire. Roman bathhouses are famous for luxury, but the water was notoriously filthy inside. Thousands of people bathed together without any chlorine or modern filtration systems available. Sick individuals covered in open sores shared the exact same water with healthy citizens. The warm pools became a perfect breeding ground for highly contagious and deadly bacteria. Physicians even advised patients to bathe in the hot waters to cure illnesses. Speaking of medicine, visiting a Roman doctor was often worse than the disease. Surgeons used primitive metal instruments without understanding the importance of basic hand washing. Scalpels and hooks were simply wiped clean with a dirty rag between patients. Consequently, even minor surgeries routinely resulted in massive infections and incredibly painful deaths. To stop severe bleeding, doctors applied burning hot iron directly onto the open wounds. Medical treatments often involved bizarre and disgusting ingredients mixed into strange medicinal potions. Gladiator blood was sometimes prescribed as a magical cure for patients with epilepsy. Animal dung was frequently applied to severe wounds in a misguided attempt to heal. Unsurprisingly, average life expectancy hovered around 25 to 30 years for most. This low average was heavily skewed by a terrifyingly high rate of infant mortality. Almost half of all Roman children did not survive to see their 10th birthday. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous, claiming the lives of countless young mothers across the empire. Midwives relied on religious chants and superstitions as much as practical medical knowledge. Unwanted infants were tragically abandoned at the city dumps to die from absolute exposure. Some of these abandoned babies were collected by slavers and raised into forced servitude. Moving to the absolute top of society, the imperial palace was no safer place. Paranoia ran deep among emperors, who constantly feared assassination by their royal guards. Poisoning was incredibly common, leading rulers to employ dedicated food tasters for every meal. Emperor Nero famously murdered his own mother and kicked his pregnant wife to death. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the emperor, frequently murdered him for higher bribes. The wealth inequality in ancient Rome was staggering and incredibly visible to all. The richest elites threw lavish banquets featuring exotic meats like flamingo tongues and peacock. The myth of the vomitorium claims they threw up just to keep eating more. In truth, a vomitorium was merely an architectural exit corridor for the crowded stadiums. But the gluttony of the elite was real, contrasting sharply with the starving masses. Proper burial was highly valued, but the poorest Romans could not afford a tomb. Their bodies were often tossed into massive open pits located just outside the walls. These rotting pits attracted wild scavengers and released terrible odors into the surrounding air. Later, vast underground catacombs were carved to securely house the dead in stacked niches. Walking through these dark tunnels, you were surrounded by thousands of quietly decaying corpses. The glory of the Roman Empire was built entirely on a foundation of suffering. From the dangerous wooden apartments to the bloody arenas, life was cheap and short. The stunning marble columns were a beautiful facade hiding a deeply flawed, brutal society. Hollywood only shows us legendary heroes, but the ordinary citizens endured a complete nightmare. This was the real ancient Rome, a city of shadows, filth, and endless struggle.